Hi, let's talk about forces. So, what is a force? Force is important in the study of science, especially in dynamics, where we factor in force in studying the state of motion of objects. How does force influence the state of motion of object? Now, what is a force? A force is a push or a pull exerted by an object to another object. And force is a vector quantity. And what's a vector quantity? A vector quantity is a physical quantity that is both described with magnitude and direction. So force is also fully described with magnitude and direction. So it means that when you have a force, let's say for example, 5 newtons, it's incomplete because we need to give to what direction is the force directed. So your force can be a push, as you can see here, or a pull. And types of forces are just variations of these push or pull as a description of force. Now there can be two groups of forces, which are the contact forces and non-contact forces. So what's the difference between contact and non-contact forces? By the term themselves, your contact force will need direct contact, while your non-contact force, it doesn't need to be physically touching each other for that force to act on that object. So contact force is a force between two bodies that are in direct contact with each other. While non-contact forces, they are also called as action at a distance force because even though they are far from each other or they have space from each other, they are separated, they can still exert force on one another. So let's look into the different kinds of contact forces. So what are some examples of contact forces? So we have here first on our list is tension force. Now what's tension force? So tension force is the force exerted by a one-dimensional continuous object such as string, a cable, a chain, or other similar objects. So you have here a rope, and that rope exerts tension force. Another contact force is normal force. So normal force is the contact force by a surface on an object. Its direction is perpendicular to the surface. As you can see here, your book your book is resting on the table, and the surface of that table is exerting a perpendicular force to that surface, which is your normal force. So again, your normal force by the term itself, normal. So it's the perpendicular force that acts on an object which is moving away to that from that surface. Next example of contact forces is your friction force. So friction force is the contact force opposing sliding motion between surfaces. So your friction can be sliding friction, can be static friction, or can also be your rolling friction. Now, a special type of friction is air resistance, which is the friction or the opposing force exerted by the air as an object moves through it. Air resistance can also be called as drag force. So all of those are friction. Next, you have the spring force. So spring force is the force exerted by a spring. So it's either a push or a pull exerted on an object by a spring. Another example of contact force is thrust. So thrust is a contact force that is the general term for the forces that move objects such as rockets, airplanes, cars, and people. So when we walk, the term that we use to describe the force that makes us walk is thrust. Cars as well, and your airplanes and rockets. The force that lifts your rocket and the force that keeps airplanes moving in the atmosphere, we call that as thrust. Next, you have your applied force. So applied force is, by the term itself, the force that is applied on an object. So it's either a push or a pull, since forces are either push or pull, that is exerted by an object or a person to another object. So those are your examples of contact forces. Now let's look into non-contact forces. So what are non-contact forces? Non-contact forces will include gravitational force. As you can see, or if you already understand what gravity is, you don't need objects to be touching each other or to be in direct contact with each other for that force to be exerted on the object. So gravitational force is an attractive force. It's always an attractive force. It does not repel. This is the non-contact force between two bodies in the universe due to the gravitational attraction between them. Next, another non-contact force is magnetic force. It is the attractive or repulsive force that is exerted between the poles of a magnet. So as if you can remember as well, in your lessons in high school about magnets, a magnet can exhibit attractive and repulsive forces. If the poles are opposite, then it will be an attractive force. If the poles are the same, then it will be a repulsive force, which works the same as well in electrostatic force. So in electrostatic force, it is the attractive or repulsive force between electrically charged objects. So your charges can either be positive or negative. And when you have opposite charges, then the particles or the objects will attract each other. And if you have the same charge or the same charge, then they will have an a repulsive force, or they will repel each other. And this type of force as well, you don't need to stick these objects together for the force to manifest or for the force to act on that object. So these are your examples of non-contact forces. So the study of those type of forces, or it's important for you to know that these type of forces, especially if you are studying dynamics, because you need to know what kind of forces are influencing the state of motion of an object. And it's also important that you know what kind of force to write when you make a free body diagram. So to know about free body diagram, just watch my video on free body diagrams. Thank you very much for listening, and bye.